You think you're winning when you go no contact, right? You think they'll wake up, see your worth, and come crawling back. But here's the truth: the avoidants don't react the way you expect. They don't process emotions like you do. And if you don't understand what's happening in their mind, you might end up playing right into their hands. Today, I'm going to break it all down for you: what avoidants secretly hope for when you go no contact, and how you can flip the script to regain control. Avoidants thrive when they feel like they're still in control. When you go no contact, their first instinct isn't panic, it's curiosity. They don't experience the immediate fear of loss the way you do. Instead, they wonder if you're still thinking about them, if you're still emotionally hooked, and if they still hold power over you. It's not always conscious, but it's deeply ingrained in their attachment style. They rely on the fact that you've been emotionally invested, and they assume you'll struggle to detach. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They believe that no contact will automatically trigger a reaction, forcing the avoidant to realize their mistake and come running back. But avoidants don't respond that way. Instead, they retreat further into their comfort zone. If they assume you're still thinking about them, checking their social media, or reminiscing about the past, they don't feel the urgency to act. They tell themselves that the emotional connection is still intact, even if there's no direct communication. That's why many avoidants don't reach out quickly or at all. They don't fear immediate abandonment. They expect to still exist in your mind. They want you in a state of obsession, questioning their silence, reading into their past messages, and analyzing every small interaction. They want you to feel their absence in a way that keeps you stuck, not moving forward. When they sense that you're emotionally preoccupied with them, they don't need to make an effort. You're doing all the emotional labor on your own. They hope that your mind will be consumed with what went wrong, that you'll replay the good moments, and that you'll start second-guessing yourself. The psychological trap here is that your brain craves closure, but an avoidant rarely provides it. They withdraw, leaving loose ends, creating an open loop that your mind desperately tries to close. That's why no contact can feel agonizing at first. It's not just about missing them, it's about needing resolution. But avoidants don't operate on the same emotional wavelength. They don't give clear endings because that would require vulnerability, something they avoid at all costs. Instead, they remain distant, indifferent on the surface, but subtly leaving room for doubt in your mind. If you've ever found yourself obsessively checking their last online status, hoping for a text, or wondering if they're thinking about you, you're experiencing exactly what they expect. The longer you stay in this emotional limbo, the more they maintain the upper hand. And here's the dangerous part: if you eventually reach out first, even if it's just to clear the air, you confirm their assumption that you are never truly gone. That moment of weakness reassures them that you're still emotionally available, which means they can continue their pattern without consequence. This is why understanding their mindset is so critical. The power shift happens when you break free from their expected script. The moment you stop feeding their sense of control, when you genuinely let go, is the moment they start to feel the loss. But as long as you're stuck in obsession, they remain exactly where they want to be, just out of reach, but never fully gone. The avoidants have a deep fear of intimacy, but that doesn't mean they don't want connection. They just want it on their own terms. When you go no contact, their immediate reaction is not to chase, but to wait. They don't operate from a place of emotional urgency. Instead, they expect that at some point you will reach out first. They believe that if you truly care, you won't be able to stay away forever. This belief reinforces their defensive mechanisms and allows them to remain emotionally detached while still feeling a sense of control over the situation. Their subconscious expectation is rooted in their attachment style. Avoidants often view relationships as something that threatens their independence, so when distance is created, they don't experience it as a complete loss. Instead, they frame it as a temporary break, one that they assume will end when you eventually give in. They convince themselves that your silence isn't permanent, but rather a test or a moment of emotional overwhelm that will pass. They see your no contact as something they can outlast because in their minds, emotional distance is their comfort zone. This is why they don't panic when you initially pull away. Unlike anxious attachment styles that immediately fear abandonment, avoidants interpret space as something natural, even necessary. They don't feel an immediate void because they're used to suppressing emotions. But that doesn't mean they're unaffected. Deep down, there's a hope that you will be the one to break the silence, reinforcing the belief that they don't need to put in the effort to repair the connection. They would rather wait for you to come back than take the risk of making themselves vulnerable. If they cared about you, why wouldn't they reach out first? The answer lies in their fear of rejection and emotional exposure. Initiating contact would require them to acknowledge their feelings, and avoidants are experts at suppressing those. They don't want to be the one to admit they miss you because doing so would put them in a position of emotional neediness, something they desperately avoid. Instead, they retreat into a state of passive waiting, hoping that time will weaken your resolve. This is why so many people who go no contact eventually break it themselves. The silence starts to feel unbearable, and they assume the avoidant isn't affected. But in reality, the avoidant is just better at appearing indifferent. The moment you reach out first, they take it as validation that they were right all along, that they didn't need to change or take accountability. They see it as proof that you're still invested, which means they can continue their usual pattern of pushing and pulling. What they don't expect is for you to actually hold your ground. When you maintain no contact longer than they anticipated, the dynamic begins to shift. The power that once held over your emotions starts to weaken. They begin to wonder if they miscalculated your attachment, and for the first time, they're forced to sit with the possibility that you might not return. And that's when the real impact of no contact begins to set in for them. Avoidants rely on time to work in their favor. When you go no contact, they don't immediately feel the weight of your absence the way you do. Instead, they assume that as the days, weeks, or even months go by, your emotions will soften and the reasons you walked away will start to fade. They count on the fact that human memory is selective, that over time you'll begin to romanticize the past and minimize the pain they caused. It's not that they deliberately manipulate you into forgetting, it's that they understand, either consciously or subconsciously, how emotional attachment works. In the beginning, you may feel strong in your decision to go no contact. You remember why you left, the emotional distance they created, the lack of consistency, the way they made you question your own worth. But as time passes, nostalgia starts to creep in. You find yourself thinking about the good times, the moments when they were affectionate, the laughter you shared, the deep conversations that made you feel connected. And because avoidants often have a pattern of being both distant and intensely engaging, when they do show up, those highs feel even more amplified in your memory. So this is exactly what they hope for. They don't have to do anything but wait. They don't have to take responsibility. They don't have to make any grand gestures, and they don't have to change. They just need you to sit with your own thoughts long enough that the emotional intensity of the breakup starts to fade. The pain that once felt so clear and undeniable becomes blurry, and instead of focusing on why things didn't work, you begin to wonder if you overreacted. Maybe they weren't as unavailable as you thought. Maybe you were too emotional, too demanding. Maybe they weren't the problem, maybe it was just bad timing. The danger here is that once nostalgia takes over, you start seeking proof that they still care. You check their social media, reread old messages, or even send a casual text to see how they're doing. And that's exactly when they reappear, not because they've changed, but because they sense that you're in a vulnerable state. They show up just enough to keep you engaged, reinforcing the cycle all over again. Avoidants don't rely on grand apologies or sweeping declarations of love to win you back. They rely on your own mind working against you. They know that people crave closure, and when you don't get it, your brain fills in the gaps with the version of the story that hurts the least. That's why so many people who go no contact eventually break it themselves. They convince themselves that reaching out will bring clarity, when in reality, it only reopens old wounds. What avoidants don't expect is for you to break free from this pattern. They don't expect you to hold on to the truth of what actually happened rather than the illusion of what could have been. The moment you stop letting time distort your reality is the moment their hold over you begins to crumble. Avoidants don't want to lose you completely, but they also don't want to change. So instead of offering real emotional depth or commitment, they give you breadcrumbs, just enough to keep you emotionally invested, but never enough to truly satisfy your need for connection. This is one of their most effective tactics because it plays directly into your emotions, keeping you in a state of uncertainty where you constantly wonder what their actions mean. They won't necessarily reach out with a heartfelt message or a grand apology. Instead, it might be something small, like on your social media posts, or random text saying, "Hey, hope you're doing well," or even just watching your stories. These actions seem insignificant on the surface, but they're calculated in their effect. They trigger you to think about them, to question whether they still care, to wonder if they're testing the waters. This is exactly what they want. They want you to stay mentally and emotionally connected to them while they remain comfortably distant. The reason breadcrumbs work so well is that they create hope. Hope that maybe they're changing, maybe they're realizing what they lost, maybe this time will be different. But in reality, these small gestures are not signs of transformation, they're ways to maintain control. If they truly wanted to reconnect in a meaningful way, they wouldn't be sending vague texts or passive interactions. They would be having real conversations, taking accountability, and making changes in how they show up. But avoidants rarely do this because true emotional engagement requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what they fear. This pattern is especially dangerous because it taps into your emotional investment. You don't want to seem like you're overreacting by ignoring a simple message. So you respond. Maybe you keep it short, maybe you try to play it cool, but in their mind, they've just confirmed that you're still available. You're still interested, and that means they don't have to put in any real effort. They can continue giving you just enough attention to keep you around without ever fully committing. Over time, this creates a toxic cycle. You start craving those small interactions, analyzing them for meaning, and waiting for the next breadcrumb to drop. This puts them in a position of power, allowing them to dictate the rhythm of your connection while you remain stuck in limbo. What they hope is that you will settle for this, that you will accept these tiny, meaningless gestures as proof that they still care, even when their actions consistently show otherwise. The only way to break free from the cycle is to recognize it for what it is. Avoidants don't respond to pressure, but they do respond to absence. When they realize their breadcrumbs no longer work, that you no longer react, that their small attempts at maintaining control fall flat, that's when the dynamic shifts. That's when they start to wonder if they truly lost you. And that is when they are forced to face the reality they've been avoiding all along. Avoidants may seem indifferent on the surface, but deep down they hope you never fully heal. They don't necessarily want you to suffer, but they do want to remain significant in your mind. As long as you're still thinking about them, analyzing the relationship, and holding on to the idea that things could have been different, they feel a sense of control. They rely on the fact that you were emotionally invested, and they assume you'll struggle to detach completely. This is why they don't offer proper closure, because leaving things unresolved keeps you emotionally tethered to them. Healing means seeing the relationship for what it truly was, not just the idealized version your mind wants to believe. But avoidants count on the fact that emotional wounds take time to process. They expect that after the initial pain of no contact fades, you'll start longing for the connection again. They hope you'll feel a void they once filled, and that you'll mistake this emptiness for a sign that you should reconnect. They assume that even if they don't reach out, you'll keep them alive in your thoughts, replaying moments, questioning what went wrong, and wondering if they ever really cared. This is why they often reappear just as you start making progress. The moment you begin to detach, when you start focusing on yourself, when you're no longer seeking answers, they sense it. Maybe it's intuition, maybe it's subtle changes in your behavior, or maybe they notice your absence in ways they didn't expect. But suddenly they feel a shift, and rather than allowing you to move on, they disrupt your healing process by dropping back into your life in a way that keeps you from fully letting go. It might not be a direct attempt to rekindle the relationship. Sometimes it's a casual message, a random interaction, or even just a reminder of their presence through social media. These moments aren't accidental. They serve a purpose to reinsert themselves into your thoughts just as you were starting to find peace. The goal isn't always to reunite. Sometimes it's simply to make sure you haven't erased them completely. Because if you do, if you truly heal, they lose the comfort of knowing they still occupy space in your heart. What avoidants don't want is for you to reach a point where their absence feels like freedom rather than loss. They don't want you to recognize that their emotional distance wasn't a reflection of your worth, but of their own fears and limitations. They don't want you to realize that you're capable of a deeper, healthier love with someone who doesn't make you question yourself. Most importantly, they don't want you to become indifferent to them, because indifference is the one thing they can't control. The moment you heal, truly heal, is the moment they lose their unspoken power. Because healing doesn't just mean moving on, it means seeing the situation with absolute clarity, free from illusion, and understanding that you were always whole with or without them. Avoidants don't always realize what they have until it's gone. At first, when you go no contact, they convince themselves that they're fine. They tell themselves they needed the space, that the distance is good for them, and that they're simply returning to their natural state of emotional independence. They rationalize your absence by believing you'll eventually return, or that their feelings will fade before they ever have to confront them. But what they don't anticipate is that true silence, prolonged and unwavering, begins to create a different kind of discomfort, one they aren't used to facing. Avoidants structure their relationships in a way that allows them to feel in control. They push you away when things get too close, but they also assume you'll always be emotionally available in some capacity. They may not want deep intimacy, but they do want the option of connection on their terms. No contact removes that option. It forces them into a position where they are no longer dictating the flow of communication, and for the first time, they have to sit with the reality of what they've lost. This realization doesn't come instantly. It builds over time as the space they once welcomed begins to feel unfamiliar. As more time passes without any sign of you reaching out, doubt begins to creep in. At first, they dismiss it, assuming you just need time before you eventually reappear. But as weeks turn into months, and there's still no word from you, their confidence begins to waver. They start to wonder if they miscalculated your attachment, if maybe you've moved on in a way they never expected. This uncertainty is unsettling for them because they've always relied on emotional detachment to protect themselves. But when they realize they might actually be the one who was left behind, it disrupts their carefully crafted sense of control. This is when the avoidant starts to feel the loss, but they won't always show it in obvious ways. Instead of directly reaching out, they might test the waters subtly. They may check your social media, bring you up in conversations with mutual friends, or even post things that seem like indirect messages meant for you to see. These are small attempts to regain a sense of connection without exposing their vulnerability. But if they receive no response, if their attempts to provoke a reaction fail, that's when the real anxiety sets in. At this point, they may try to convince themselves that they don't care, that they can move on without addressing their emotions. But deep down, the absence is undeniable. They may not express it outwardly, but internally, they begin to question whether they made a mistake. They wonder if they let go of something valuable without ever truly appreciating it. And for the first time, they are forced to face the possibility that their own avoidance cost them something real. That is the moment they begin to feel the full impact of your absence. When you go no contact with an avoidant, the initial response may not be what you expect. Unlike those with anxious attachment styles who panic at the first sign of distance, avoidants convince themselves that space is exactly what they need. They reassure themselves that they are better off without the emotional intensity of the relationship, and that in time you will come back just as you always have. But what they fail to realize is that true absence creates a void that even their strongest defenses cannot ignore. At first, they may feel relief, believing they have successfully regained control of their independence. However, as the silence lingers, something unfamiliar begins to settle in, an awareness that they may have lost something far more significant than they initially thought. The avoidant's greatest hope is that you will reach out first, breaking the silence and restoring the dynamic they are comfortable with. They count on your emotions overwhelming you, leading you to seek closure, clarity, or even reconciliation. They rely on nostalgia to work in their favor, expecting you to romanticize the good times and forget the emotional neglect. But the longer you remain silent, the more they begin to question their assumptions. Their confidence in your return starts to waver, and for the first time, they are left to sit with the consequences of their emotional detachment. They are forced to face the very thing they have spent a lifetime avoiding, the pain of losing someone who genuinely cared for them. At this stage, avoidants often resort to breadcrumbs, small, calculated actions designed to keep you emotionally engaged. Whether it's a random text, a social media interaction, or an indirect message through mutual connections, they want to know they still have a presence in your mind. These attempts are not about genuine connection or change, they are about control. They want reassurance that you still care, that they haven't been completely forgotten, and that the door remains open should they ever decide to return. But when you refuse to react, when you resist the temptation to chase or decode their mixed signals, the power shifts. The illusion they held on to, that they could always return on their own terms, begins to crumble. The most unexpected realization for an avoidant comes when they recognize that you are healing without them. They assumed you would wait, that your emotions would keep you tethered, but instead they see you moving forward. They see you reclaiming your energy, no longer seeking their validation, no longer waiting for them to change. This is when regret sets in, but by the time they truly feel the weight of their choices, it is often too late. They have spent so much time avoiding emotional depth that they never learned how to nurture a meaningful connection. And now, faced with the reality of your absence, they are left with nothing but their own unresolved emotions. True healing happens when you stop waiting for someone to realize your worth and instead realize it for yourself. No contact isn't about punishing the avoidant, it's about breaking free from the cycle of emotional inconsistency. It's about recognizing that love should never leave you feeling anxious, confused, or unworthy. The moment you stop focusing on what they hope for and start prioritizing your own growth, you reclaim your power. You become the person they never expected, the one who didn't just walk away, but the one who truly let go. And that is when you win, not by making them regret losing you, but by no longer needing them to. Thank you all for taking the time to listen, reflect, and embrace the truth about your worth and power. Walking away from an avoidant, staying firm in your decision, and choosing your own healing over their comfort is not easy, but it is necessary. You deserve a love that is consistent, a connection that brings peace rather than confusion, and a relationship where you don't have to question your value. If there's one thing I want you to take away from